This podcast treats how we apply ethical values and frameworks. When we're talking about methods for applying values and frameworks, we're talking about how we arrive at the justification for the claims that we make. In other words, we're trying to understand how can we demonstrate a sufficient reason or set of reasons for the claims that we make about what we believe is right or wrong, good or bad. It's helpful, first of all, to make a distinction between values and ethical frameworks. When we're talking about values, we're talking essentially about those concepts that you and I hold dear that guide our attitudes and our behaviors. So, for example, some values that we might have that we place in high esteem is the value of loving, of trusting, of loyalty in friendships and in families, of collegiality among our peers, of humility, of peacemaking, and there can be many, many others. All of them would be probably rooted in a kind of integrity, that is, that we are true to them and that we are true to all of them in different ways. When we're talking about frameworks, on the other hand, we're talking about a way of viewing ethical arguments. We're talking essentially about a methodology for reasoning to the claims that we make. So, for example, in our ethics course, we will be looking at many different frameworks, among them natural law, utilitarianism, social contract theory, liberal individualism, and communitarianism. There are three methods that I would like to introduce to you. They are the top-down, the bottom-up, and then finally the integrated model, which is the model that I would suggest is the strongest model of the three. The first model that we will consider is the top-down approach. The top-down approach takes a theory, takes perhaps a set of values or an ethical framework, and then applies them and seeks to apply them in the same way in all situations, in all circumstances. The general norms that go along with a given framework or with a value that one holds has preeminent status. So even before considering the experience that a person is having in which they're trying to make a decision, we first of all look, and we look almost exclusively, in fact, to the general types of norms. Let me just use an example that I think will make all of this clearer as I go through the following bullet points on the slide that is before you. Imagine if you are in a situation and you believe that maybe it would be in your best interest to tell something that is not truthful, that is, to lie. According to the top-down approach, no matter what the situation, the first norm that you really need to focus on is the value of not lying, of being honest, come what may, whatever the circumstances are, whatever the consequences are. The top-down approach says that we reach ethical judgments through these normative precepts like not lying, not cheating, not breaking promises, and that those need to cover our judgments in every situation. It's known as a deductive form for ethics because the conclusion flows logically and without contradiction from the premises or the first principles. A good example of this would be provided on that slide. And that is to say, first of all, that protection of human life is obligatory. And then we could go further and say, well, a prisoner is a human life. And therefore, if you accept both of those premises, you must accept the conclusion the protection of prisoners is obligatory. Notice that at least on the face of it, this argument is very simple. In other words, it doesn't look at what the prisoner did. It doesn't look at what punishment may need to be given to the prisoner. It doesn't even look at necessarily the protection of other human lives in terms of society if this prisoner cannot be incarcerated safely. It simply says that you must, in all situations, all circumstances, protect human life, and no matter what that human life is, it ought to be protected, that is the moral or ethical obligation. As you can see from the little chart there on the right, what it is essentially doing is taking our principles and really our judgments that we already hold, and then it is in some sense imposing them on our experiences. In some sense, it's not really looking at, again, the consequences or or some of the greater complexity of the situation. It's simply saying, here is my value, and it must be applied universally at all times, in all places, and exactly in the same way. There are some limits to the top-down way of applying ethics. It's limited because if it's presented as the only correct model, then theories and principles have priority over all instances of traditional practices, institutional rules, and different kinds of case judgments that get made in various individual circumstances. So in other words, it becomes very absolutist. That's an important word to remember. Whenever we're talking about applying some value or some framework in any situation in exactly the same way, we're really talking about a kind of absolutism. And an absolutism oftentimes does not take into account different cultural constructs, cultural values, some types of divergence that we encounter when we're trying to examine ethical arguments. We recognize that actually, in fact, particular judgments require sometimes the balancing of norms. In other words, might lying or the value of honesty compete with the value of protecting human life in some circumstances? Another way of talking about this is to recognize that sometimes particular norms need not apply in a given situation. In other words, there are times when we must prioritize which values should hold that preeminent status. So, for example, if somebody is knocking at my door and they mean to do harm to a member of my household, and they ask, is that member of my household in the house? I may choose to lie. I think most of us would agree that that might be actually morally justifiable. The top-down approach has no way of helping me to understand how that can be morally justifiable. But given some other ways of approaching it, which we'll be getting into, I recognize that maybe it would be morally justifiable actually to lie in that circumstance because a greater priority should be given to protecting human life. The top-down approach has no way of essentially evaluating which of those is kind of a higher order, or which should be given preference. The next model is called the bottom-up model, and that is where you use cases and what we refer to as inductive generalization. This is also oftentimes referred to as casuistry or case-based reasoning. In case-based reasoning, what we look at is the individual cases. So we look at one particular ethical question without really taking into account the ethical principles that might guide our reflection. So in other words, what is given preeminent status here is really experience and also building analogies or comparisons between different kinds of ethical problems. You'll notice from the little graphic that we move essentially from experience, and then from there we go to judgments. So you can see in many ways this bottom-up model is just the opposite of the top-down model, because this, after all, concentrates on the practical decision-making in a particular ethical issue. And in many ways, it actually leaves out the rules or the norms and says that those are more derivative instead of primary. In other words, the meaning, the function, and the weight of a principle are derived from previous moral struggles and reflection in particular circumstances. They don't apply universally in all circumstances, and they may change. They may be modified, they may be revised, depending on cultural conditions, on institutional norms, on even mores and taboos of a society. So once again, the bottom-up model really says that ethical decisions are made when principles, rules, and rights conflict, which they often do. There's a certain legitimacy to that. But then it even goes so far as to say that there is no further recourse to a higher principle. That, in other words, whatever the principles are that should guide human behavior or human attitudes, that those principles may not apply in certain situations. The other claim that it makes, and you may have heard people reflect a similar sentiment, is that we're almost always more certain about ethical conclusions than about why they are correct. So this may even go so far as to say that a person has a gut feeling that some course of action is right or wrong, but they're not really able to put their finger on some kind of rational way of arguing why it is right or wrong. there are significant limits to the bottom-up way of applying ethics. First of all, the bottom-up way of applying ethics ignores the fact that the way of creating an analogy between two cases, that it actually still remains a rule or a principle of action. That, in other words, it's virtually impossible to separate different circumstances, different situations that a person may encounter from the values that we hold. And then finally, if this is used exclusively, then this is a complete ethical relativism. That is to say that it will say that there is really no right or wrong. It is simply what a person determines in one particular individual ethical circumstance. That can be self-contradictory. That can be self-refuting. Because if you think about it, as soon as I say that there is no universal value or there is no kind of obligation that all of us must be responsible for, have I not, in that situation, actually just created a norm? In other words, I've just created an obligation that people ought not to use any kind of universal value to determine the rightness or wrongness of actions. And as soon as I've done that, I have actually created a universal value. So you can see that that actually self-refutes. This brings us to our third model, the model that I am going to very much espouse in this course, and that is referred to as the integrated model, otherwise known as coherence theory or reflective equilibrium. In this particular model, we recognize that ethical frameworks are more of a process than a finished product. In other words, the frameworks are valuable. The frameworks should be used. They should be understood. But they also need to be understood as a dynamic, as something that can help us to wade through the opacity of some rather tricky ethical issues. And yet they may still actually be revised. When we are making ethical decisions, we understand that we must continuously test, revise, and specify what are the ethical beliefs that we hold and why we hold them and how they can apply, perhaps even differently, in different situations. This way of applying ethics is far more demanding because it requires for us to enter into what I refer to as the opacity of ethical issues, really a kind of obscurity, a recognition that sometimes arriving at the right answer requires a great deal of discernment, a great deal of reflection, a great deal of using our thought to understand what is the best thing that should be done in this situation. You'll notice from the graphic there that I show how essentially we are involved in a loop. We take norms that we have, for example, protect human life, value human life, and then we look at the experiences of how do we do that, how do we best do that, how do we weigh that against different values, that value of honesty that I related earlier in this podcast. And we go through this critical reflective process where we understand that some values are perhaps more important than others, and we need to weight them more heavily. We don't discard them. We don't say that they are meaningless. We don't trivialize them. But we also resist the temptation to become absolutists. We also recognize that circumstances change, that people's motivations should be taken into account, that trying to understand the outcomes of different courses of action should be taken very seriously. And yet at the same time, we also don't want to become relativists because we recognize that there are certain values that are transcultural, that are extremely important, that become essentially our guideposts. And once again, we cannot discard them, we cannot downplay them. So it is this critical reflective process that this course is essentially all about in terms of weighing and balancing various values and recognizing when a framework actually fits and helps us to come to a clear conclusion and when a framework perhaps is too limited in order to do so. Because during our class time, we'll actually be looking at these three models and we'll be showing how those first two models in particular have some weaknesses that really render them insufficient in and of themselves, and also why that integrated model is kind of a better model for considering different ethical issues. What I'd like to ask you to do is to think of some clear, concrete examples. Think of some ethical dilemmas that either you or perhaps some of your family members or friends friends have encountered in which it wasn't immediately clear what the right thing to do was. And perhaps you have seen people use that bottom-down approach, and you saw some of the weaknesses as a consequence of seeing how it played itself out. Or maybe you saw them use the bottom-up approach, and once again you saw how it didn't really work out very well when people did that. And so can you think of a time when you or those who you know actually used this integrated model and arrived at a very good decision? Perhaps there was still some pain and suffering that resulted. However, people were able to look back and say, we did the right thing.